1965. The world was watching Vietnam. It was watching the Cold War. It was watching two superpowers inch toward annihilation. But high in the freezing, jagged mountains of Kashmir, in canyons where the wind cuts through bone, a different kind of war was being born. A secret war. A war of shadows, deception, and fatal miscalculation. They called it Operation Gibraltar. Thousands of trained fighters, disguised as locals, crossed the line in the dead of night. Their mission? To ignite a mass uprising behind enemy lines, to change the map of South Asia forever. What followed was not a revolution. It was a catastrophe, and the ripple effects are still being felt today.
To understand Gibraltar, you have to understand the obsession. The obsession of Pakistan's military planners in the early 1960s. Since partition in 1947, the question of Kashmir had never been resolved. The princely state had acceded to India under disputed circumstances. UN resolutions called for a plebiscite, a vote that never happened. For Pakistan, this was not just a territorial grievance. It was an existential wound. By 1965, Pakistan's military leadership, under Field Marshal Ayub Khan and his foreign minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, believed a window of opportunity was opening. India had been humiliated in the 1962 war with China. Its military was still recovering. Its political leadership was fragile, following the death of Nehru in 1964. The strategic calculation went like this. The Kashmiri population was restless. Discontent was simmering. All it needed was a spark. A vanguard of trained men who would arrive, link up with local resistance, and set off a people's revolution that India would be powerless to stop. This calculation was built almost entirely on assumptions, and every single one of those assumptions was wrong. But in the confidence of that era, in the war rooms of Rawalpindi, where officers mapped infiltration routes and rehearsed scenarios, the plan looked brilliant. On paper, the operation was conceived primarily by Pakistan's Foreign Minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, with military support from the Director General of the Inter-Services Intelligence. The code name, Gibraltar, was chosen deliberately. Just as Muslim forces had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar to liberate Iberia in 711 AD, these men would cross the Ceasefire Line to liberate Kashmir. The plan was divided into specific force groups, each named after a historical Muslim commander. There was Force Tariq, Force Khalid, Force Saladin, Force Babar, Force Qasim. Each unit had a designated area of operations across the Kashmir Valley. Approximately 5,000 men were to infiltrate. They were drawn largely from Pakistani special forces, the Azad Kashmir Regular Force, and local volunteers. They would cross in small groups over multiple nights, wearing civilian clothes, carrying light weapons. Their job was not to fight the Indian Army directly. Their job was to reach the population, distribute weapons, sabotage infrastructure, and fan the flames of revolt. There was one fundamental assumption at the heart of all of this, that the people of the Kashmir Valley were waiting for them, that they would open their doors, welcome the fighters, and rise up. The planners in Rawalpindi did not fully account for one thing. What if they were wrong about that assumption? What if they were completely, catastrophically wrong? August 1965. The men began crossing the ceasefire line in waves, by night, through mountain passes, through dense forests, through terrain that punished the unprepared. The early crossings went undetected. The Indian Army had no immediate intelligence on the scale of what was happening. For a few days, the operation appeared to be working. Then came the first catastrophic mistake. One of the infiltrating groups made contact with local Kashmiri shepherds. And those shepherds, rather than joining the uprising, reported the armed strangers to the Indian authorities. This was the moment the entire operation began to unravel, because it was not an isolated incident. Across the valley, as infiltrators made contact with the local population, the response was the same: suspicion, fear, and in many cases, cooperation with the Indian Army. The fundamental assumption, the one the entire operation rested on, was false. The Kashmiri population was not waiting for armed fighters from across the line. Many were not ready for an armed uprising, and those who had genuine grievances were not prepared to risk their lives and their families for a plan they knew nothing about and had not been consulted on. Within days, the Indian Army had a clear picture of the operation. Search and destroy missions were launched. The infiltrators found themselves not fighting alongside a grateful population, but hunted through the same mountains they had entered with such confidence.
As the infiltration collapsed, India made a decisive military move that Pakistan had not anticipated. On August 28, 1965, Indian forces launched an attack to capture the Haji Pass, a key mountain pass that was one of the main infiltration corridors into the Kashmir Valley. Haji sat at over 8,600 feet. It was rugged, cold, and strategically vital. Pakistani troops defending it fought with extraordinary courage, but the Indian advance was relentless. By August 28th, India had captured Haji. It was a significant military blow. The infiltration route was now cut. The operation was not just failing, it was being actively dismantled from multiple directions. Pakistan now faced a choice: accept the failure and try to contain the damage, or escalate. Pakistan chose to escalate, and that decision transformed a failed covert operation into a full-scale conventional war. On September 1st, 1965, Pakistan launched Operation Grand Slam, a conventional armored thrust through the Chamb sector in Jammu, aiming to cut the main road linking Jammu to Srinagar. If it succeeded, India's entire military position in Kashmir could be threatened. India responded by doing something Pakistan had not expected. Rather than simply defend in Kashmir, India opened a second front. On September 6th, Indian forces launched a massive ground assault across the international border toward Lahore. What had begun as a covert operation in mountain canyons was now a full-scale war, with tank columns advancing on Lahore, Pakistan's second-largest city, and the largest armored battles in Asia since World War II taking place in the plains of Punjab. The Battle of Asal Uttar, the Battle of Chawinda. Pakistani Patton tanks against Indian centurions. Thousands of men fighting across the same flat farmland that had been divided between two nations just 18 years earlier. Both sides suffered enormous losses. Neither achieved its strategic objectives. A UN-brokered ceasefire came into effect on September 23, 1965, 17 days after India had crossed the international border. The Tashkent Agreement in January 1966 formally ended the conflict. Under Soviet mediation, both sides agreed to withdraw to pre-war positions. Haji Pass, captured at great cost by India, was handed back to Pakistan. Kashmir remained divided exactly as before. The secret war had started with the ambition of changing the map of South Asia. It ended without a single border moving a single inch. So what did Operation Gibraltar actually achieve, and what did it cost? The military cost was enormous. Thousands of soldiers killed on both sides, hundreds of tanks destroyed, entire villages displaced, an economy already under strain pushed to the breaking point. But the strategic cost went deeper than numbers. Gibraltar shattered Pakistan's central assumption about Kashmir.
that a popular uprising was imminent, that armed infiltrators would be welcomed as liberators. That assumption was never credibly held again. For India, the 1965 war produced a complex legacy. The Indian Army demonstrated that it had recovered from the 1962 humiliation, but the failure to achieve a decisive result and the return of Haji at Tashkent left many in India bitter. Lal Bahadur Shastri, the Indian Prime Minister who had authorized the bold response, died in Tashkent the day after signing the agreement. The circumstances of his death remain contested to this day. For the people of Kashmir, who had been the intended beneficiaries of Operation Gibraltar, who had never been consulted, who had borne the brunt of fighting on their land, the legacy was one of deeper entrenchment, heavier militarization, more checkpoints, more suspicion, and a conflict that showed no signs of resolution. The lessons of Gibraltar reverberated through the following decades. They were lessons about the gap between what planners believe and what populations actually want, about the dangers of building a military operation on intelligence assessments that confirm what you already wish to be true, about how a covert action, once it begins to fail, can drag an entire nation into a war it was not prepared to fight.
The men who crossed those mountains in August 1965 were not cowards. They were trained, motivated, and brave. They crossed in the dead of night through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, believing they were part of something historic. And, in a sense, they were. Because the story of Operation Gibraltar is one of the most consequential and least understood chapters of the post-partition history of South Asia. It is a story that helps explain why the Kashmir conflict has lasted not years, but generations. Why the borders drawn in blood in 1947 have never been accepted as permanent by any side. And why, decades later, two nuclear-armed nations still watch each other across a line that was never meant to be permanent. Operation Gibraltar failed, but its failure did not close the Kashmir question. If anything, it calcified it. And the men who planned it from comfortable war rooms in Rawalpindi, the men who drew the maps, named the force groups, and assumed the populations would rise, never fully reckoned with the cost that their assumptions imposed on others. Do you think Operation Gibraltar was doomed from the moment it was conceived? Or was there a version of this plan that could have succeeded with better intelligence, better timing, or better execution? Drop your analysis in the comments. I read every single one. And if this deep dive gave you the history you were looking for, the history that most channels won't cover, then subscribe, because there is a lot more where this came from. I'm War and Military History. Stay sharp, stay informed,